Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, although I am really tempted to have a long dialogue with the clerk about the virtues of curling in light of her fascination from Friday, I rise to talk about the guy in our rotunda down here, President General George Washington, having yesterday been his 294th birthday. I'm fortunate, as you know, to represent his home in Fairfax County, and I always like to just talk on his day, on the things we can learn from his life here in the Senate. You know, we often talk about political capital in terms of votes, polling numbers, other things that we all keep track of. George Washington was a leader who he understood a different kind of math when it came to political capital. He viewed character as the only hard currency that elected officials have in this business. He also knew that if he was going to lead and build a system that was based on the consent of the governed, that people aren't only consenting to your policies, but they also are consenting to your integrity as an elected official. If the public stops believing in you as a person, they eventually stop believing in the institution itself. And so it's very important that we all keep that in mind as we conduct ourselves. Last year I talked about his actions at Newburgh. If you all recall, at Newburgh up in New York, many of his officers were very upset about the fact they weren't getting paid, and they had a meeting to talk about having a mutiny and march on Congress to conduct basically a martial law sort of military takeover of government so they get themselves paid. And General Washington at that meeting walked into the meeting and basically pulled some his they call them his spectacles, his glasses, out of his pocket, and told them that he had basically grown blind in his service to the country in that war. And that moment, by revealing his frailty, caused his officers to basically recommit themselves to the idea of a civilian-governed military in honor of the shared sacrifice that he had gone through with them as their leader. And he had built himself a reservoir of trust amongst the people he served with through that shared sacrifice. So the lesson from that is clear. Trust is demanded by our office. It's not just demanded by our office, it is earned in the trenches of shared service. That's what I think a lot of folks in the military understand. He also had a legendary temper, but he's also remembered for his stoicism. And the few people who are left who served with Senator Puller, my predecessor, would recall that she often left copies of George Washington's 110 Rules of Civility that he had to transcribe repeatedly as a child. Senator Puller would leave them here for everybody in the Senate to make sure they read them. He also understood that civility is the oil that keeps the gears of democracy churning along and prevents them from grinding to a halt. I think we in this chamber appreciate that. As I've noticed in the 10 years I've served here, we tend to be a little more civil to each other than down the hall. But that's also a practice that we live by in the state Senate. And General Washington, he treated his cabinet like in a civil manner, which included, by the way, at the time, bitter rivals like Hamilton and Jefferson, who actually served in his cabinet, people who eventually were on the opposite sides of the political parties that formed. If you recall, in the Hamilton play, some of Jefferson and Hamilton's battles are recorded in what they called Cabinet Battle I and Cabinet Battle II, at the conclusion of which Thomas Jefferson told Hamilton where he was going to put his shoe. And then Jefferson reminded him that Hamilton wasn't get what he wanted because you don't have the votes. You don't have the votes. And if you recall, at the end of that, George Washington told the two of them to go outside and pulled Hamilton aside and told him to go outside and figure out a compromise because he was going to have to figure out something. He treated the people in his cabinet and people in deep conflict with civility because he understood that when we treat an opponent as an enemy of the state, we also degrade the state itself. Not everybody in this state agrees on how it ought to be governed. We're obviously some of us in here are on different sides of things. But to Washington, restraint and the failure to use power was not a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate proof of a leader's fitness to govern. So just think about that. You don't always have to punish or use your power in order to show people how powerful you are. And his greatest act, which I also talked about 2 years ago, was itself in leaving the stage. He often won by retreating or at the very end, surrendering power. And by stepping down after 2 terms, he proved the American experiment was about the office and not about the man. He created that precedent that he wasn't going to be a king. So for those of us in this room today, the challenge here to us today is the same. Are we, all of us, each of us, building that reservoir of trust that can survive an unpopular but necessary decision? All of us are going to have to make that choice sooner or later in this place. It's inevitable. Are we treating our reputations as a private asset or a public trust? Think about that. Do we have the courage to be the adult in the room when political winds demand a firebrand? Because that's often something that we have to consider. Think about how he handled that. So, Madam President, Washington's legacy is, and it tells us that policies are written in ink, but the foundation of our country is written in trust. Please remember that. And please remember that trust, folks, is built in drips, but it's lost in buckets. Think about that. Like General Washington, let all of us strive to leave the bucket of public trust full for each of us and for this chamber fuller than when we found it. I hope those are things we can think about today, the day after George Washington's 294th birthday. Thank you, Madam President.